What if I told you that the person sitting next to you in a coffee shop, walking past you in a hallway, or even teaching your kids could be the only thing standing between your family and complete chaos? The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as students shuffled through the cramped hallways of Rockford Heights High. Lockers slammed shut with metallic echoes that bounced off faded motivational posters peeling at the edges. The air carried that distinctive mix of industrial cleaning supplies and teenage anxiety that every high school seems to possess. And there, moving through it all like a ghost in plain sight, was the man nobody really saw. Here's the thing about being invisible, it's not about hiding. It's about being so perfectly ordinary that your mind simply slides past. The students barely lifted their eyes when the new transfer counselor walked by. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with that clean-cut appearance that screamed safe adult authority figure. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the harsh hallway lighting just right, and when he smiled, it was the kind of polite, measured expression that said, "I'm here to help with your college applications." His laminated ID badge swayed gently as he walked. Mr. Henry Park, student counselor, transfer from Washington, D.C. Educational Services. The paperwork was flawless. The backstory was airtight. Even his coffee order at the teacher's lounge was perfectly mundane. Black coffee, no sugar, maybe a stir stick if he was feeling adventurous. But Henry Park wasn't a counselor. He was a ghost with a government clearance. Henry was CIA, a 15-year veteran of the kind of operations that never make the evening news. He'd walked through war zones disguised as a humanitarian aid worker, sat in boardrooms pretending to be an accountant while photographing classified documents with a pen camera, and once spent 3 months as a janitor in a foreign embassy, emptying trash cans that contained the secrets of nations. This assignment was supposed to be different. Routine. Almost boring. An anonymous threat had been intercepted by NSA's digital surveillance network. Someone using Rockford Heights High School's IP address had been accessing suspicious websites. Probably just some kid trying to impress friends with edgy internet behavior. Maybe downloading movies. Maybe something slightly more concerning but ultimately harmless. The kind of lead that usually evaporated under scrutiny. But Henry had learned something in his years of hunting shadows. The most dangerous threats are the ones that look like nothing at all. So while his colleagues back at Langley were focused on international arms dealers and terrorist cells, Henry walked the halls of a middle American high school with the same predatory awareness he'd use in hostile territory. He noticed everything. The way certain students avoided eye contact. The teachers who seemed more tired than they should be. The janitor who worked odd hours. The fact that the old media lab, officially unused since budget cuts disbanded the AV club 2 years ago, still had a faint electrical hum coming from behind its locked door. Every morning, Henry sat in the back row of the auditorium during the daily announcements. While students dozed and teachers checked their phones, he was cataloging behavioral patterns, noting who was present, who was absent, and who seemed to be paying attention to things they shouldn't be. Every night, he returned to his modest apartment and connected a laptop to a signal analyzer hidden in his briefcase. The device was the size of a hardcover book but contained processing power that could intercept and decode digital communications within a half-mile radius. It was the kind of equipment that technically didn't exist and definitely wasn't supposed to be in civilian hands. For 3 weeks, he found nothing but the digital noise of suburban teenage life. Social media drama. Homework submissions. The occasional attempt to bypass the school's internet filters to watch YouTube videos. Then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Henry's world shifted. The coffee was still steaming in his cup when the analyzer's screen lit up with an anomaly that made his blood run cold. A massive data spike originating from the school's network, but not from any of the active computer labs or administrative offices. The signal was coming from the old media lab. The room that was supposed to be empty. The room that was supposed to be forgotten. Henry stared at the readout, his training warring with disbelief. The data stream was encrypted with military-grade protocols. The kind of encryption that wasn't available to civilians. The kind of encryption that was specifically designed to hide communications between foreign intelligence services and their assets. And it was happening 20 feet from where teenagers were taking their SATs. His hands were steady as he ran the trace, but inside, his mind was racing through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. The IP address matched the one from the original threat. But this wasn't some kid sending anonymous messages online. This was a professional intelligence operation using an American high school as cover. The file being transmitted wasn't homework. It wasn't a student's digital prank. It was a piece of decrypted code that made Henry's CIA training scream warnings in his head. Something military. Something classified. Something that could change the balance of power in ways most people couldn't even imagine. As Henry sat in that empty apartment, staring at evidence of what might be the most sophisticated infiltration attempt he'd ever encountered, one thought cut through his professional composure like a blade. How long had they been here? And what else had they already stolen? The man nobody noticed was about to discover that sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary secrets. And sometimes, those secrets can end everything. Have you ever wondered what's really happening in the places you walk past every day without a second thought? That night, Henry didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that data readout, the impossible spike of encrypted military communications coming from a supposedly abandoned classroom in suburban America. At 2:47 a.m., he made his decision. The school was different at night. The familiar daytime sounds of teenage chaos were replaced by an almost oppressive silence broken only by the whisper of the heating system and the distant hum of emergency lighting. Henry's footsteps echoed differently in the empty corridors, each sound seeming to travel further than it should, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, his lock-picking tools making quick work of the media lab's door. The lock was older than it should be for a room that was supposedly secured and forgotten. Someone had been maintaining it. Someone had been using it. The smell hit him first, that distinct odor of electronics running hot, of circuits working overtime. It was faint but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years in CIA safe houses filled with surveillance equipment. The flashlight beam swept across what looked like exactly what an abandoned media lab should look like. Dusty shelves lined with old VHS tapes, their labels faded and peeling. Film reels covered in cobwebs. A projector that probably hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. Everything perfectly staged to look forgotten and worthless. But Henry's training had taught him to look deeper. The dust patterns were wrong. Some areas were cleaner than others, as if heavy equipment had been moved across the floor recently. The electrical outlets showed signs of recent use, no dust in the plug holes, subtle scorch marks that indicated high power draw. And then he found it. 3 floor tiles in the corner weren't sitting quite right. They were slightly raised, as if something beneath them was pushing upward. Henry knelt and carefully pried up the first tile, his heart pounding with the kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing you're about to confirm your worst fears. Beneath the innocent-looking classroom floor was a technological marvel that belonged in a foreign intelligence services command center, not an American high school. 5 server towers, each one humming with lethal efficiency. Professional-grade networking equipment that cost more than most people's cars. Cables snaking through carefully drilled holes that led to a satellite uplink disguised as an old TV antenna on the roof. The entire setup was powered by a sophisticated tap into the school's electrical system that would be invisible to routine maintenance. This wasn't the work of amateurs. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he connected his analyzer to the network. The data flowing through these servers was like staring into the digital nervous system of a foreign intelligence operation that had been years in the planning. The code being transmitted had the unmistakable structure of a military defense protocol. Not just any protocol, this was a backdoor into the satellite communications network used by NORAD for missile detection and early warning systems. The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. A successful breach of these systems could blind America's ability to detect incoming missiles. In the wrong hands, this access could allow an enemy to feed false information to the military's most critical defense networks. They could trigger false alarms that would cause the military to scramble fighters and raise alert levels unnecessarily. They could hide real threats until it was too late to respond. They could potentially even manipulate the systems that controlled automated defense responses. This wasn't just espionage. This was preparation for war. Henry's training kicked in over his shock. He activated the emergency beacon in his watch, a device that would send an encrypted distress signal directly to a CIA response team. No questions asked. No bureaucratic delays. Just immediate action. 10 minutes later, the quiet suburban night was shattered by the arrival of unmarked vehicles. Not the flashy tactical response you see in movies, this was the real thing. Professional intelligence operatives in plain clothes, moving with the kind of silent efficiency that comes from years of practice in situations where failure means catastrophe. The students sleeping in their beds 2 miles away never heard the helicopters. The families in the surrounding neighborhoods never saw the satellite trucks that temporarily jammed all cell phone signals in a 3-block radius. The local police were quietly informed that a federal training exercise was taking place and that they should disregard any unusual activity. The server farm was photographed, cataloged, and carefully dismantled by experts who understood exactly what they were looking at. Every byte of data was copied and sent to NSA cryptographers who would spend the next several months unraveling the full scope of the operation. The trail led back to a maintenance closet in the school's basement, where the operations command center had been hidden behind a false wall. The space was small but sophisticated, multiple computer monitors, communication equipment, and detailed floor plans of the school marked with sight lines and security camera blind spots. But the man responsible had vanished like smoke. The janitor listed on the school's payroll, Marcus Webb, hired 8 months ago with glowing references from a cleaning service in Detroit, didn't exist. The references were fake. The social security number belonged to a man who had died in 1987. The address on his employment application was a vacant lot. Marcus Webb was a ghost, a professional intelligence operative who had been living and working in American suburbia for months, slowly building one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage operations in recent memory. And he had been using a high school, a place full of America's children, as his base of operations. As Henry stood in that basement command center, surrounded by evidence of how close the nation had come to being compromised, one thought kept running through his mind. How many other Marcus Webbs were out there? How many other schools, hospitals, libraries, and community centers were hiding similar operations? The enemy had learned something that should terrify every American. The best place to hide is in plain sight, and the best camouflage is normalcy itself. If Henry hadn't been there, if he hadn't trusted his instincts about that suspicious IP address, the operation might have continued for months or even years. By the time it was discovered, the damage to national security could have been irreversible. One man's refusal to accept that something was probably nothing had just prevented what could have been the most devastating intelligence breach in American history. But as Henry watched the last of the evidence being loaded into unmarked vehicles, he knew this was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, other operations were already in motion. Other ordinary places were hiding extraordinary secrets. The war for America's security wasn't being fought on distant battlefields. It was being fought in the places where Americans live, work, and send their children to school. And most people would never even know it was happening. What would you say if you had just saved millions of lives, but could never tell anyone about it? 6 weeks later, Rockford Heights High School looked exactly the same as it always had. The same faded motivational posters lined the hallways. The same fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune. The same groups of students clustered around lockers, discussing weekend plans and upcoming exams. But Henry knew better. He'd learned that nothing is ever quite what it seems. The media lab had been renovated over a long weekend. New flooring, fresh paint, updated electrical systems. Officially, it was being prepared for a new computer programming class. Unofficially, every trace of the foreign intelligence operation had been erased so thoroughly that it might never have existed at all. The beauty of a successful intelligence operation is its invisibility. The students returning from spring break never knew that their school had been the site of a potential national security catastrophe. Their parents never lost sleep worrying about foreign spies using their children's classrooms as cover for espionage. The local news never reported that unmarked government vehicles had surrounded the school in the middle of the night. As far as the world knew, nothing had happened. But Principal Martha Rodriguez knew. She'd been briefed by serious men in serious suits who'd shown her serious credentials and explained, in carefully measured terms, exactly how close her school had come to being the epicenter of an international incident. So when she approached Henry, still maintaining his cover as Mr. Henry Park, transfer counselor, about speaking at the graduation ceremony, her request carried a weight that went far beyond typical ceremony planning. I think the students would benefit from hearing from someone who. She paused, choosing her words carefully, understands the importance of paying attention to details that others might miss. Henry accepted, though every instinct screamed against it. CIA operatives don't give speeches. They don't step into spotlights. They don't risk exposure for the sake of inspiration. But sometimes, the mission requires sacrifices of principle. The day of graduation arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes suburban America feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. Families filled the auditorium, cameras flashing, proud parents dabbing at their eyes as their children prepared to walk across the stage toward their futures. Henry stood backstage, adjusting his tie and watching the controlled chaos of a high school graduation. These kids had no idea how close they'd come to living in a very different world, one where America's enemies had the ability to blind the nation's missile defense systems, where the balance of global power had shifted in ways that would have affected every aspect of their lives. But that's not what his speech was about. When Principal Rodriguez introduced him as a counselor who has shown our students the importance of vigilance and attention to detail, Henry walked to the podium carrying a message that was both deeply personal and universally important. The auditorium fell quiet in that special way it does when young people sense that an adult is about to say something worth hearing. Some of the most dangerous things in life, Henry began, his voice carrying clearly to the back rows where parents held their breath, don't arrive with sirens and flashing lights. They don't announce themselves with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the sea of caps and gowns, seeing not just graduates but future leaders, future protectors, future guardians of the values that make America worth defending. The most dangerous things arrive quietly. They slip through doors we've stopped checking. They hide in places we've decided are safe. They disguise themselves as normal, ordinary, everyday occurrences that don't deserve our attention. A few parents shifted in their seats, perhaps recognizing a truth they'd been trying not to think about in an age of global uncertainty. But here's what I want you to remember as you leave this place and enter the world. Safety isn't something that happens to you. It's something that happens because of you. Because people like you decide to pay attention when others look away. Because people like you ask questions when others accept easy answers. Because people like you refuse to believe that probably nothing is good enough when the stakes are everything. Henry's voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of 15 years spent in the shadows, protecting people who would never know his name. You don't need a badge or a uniform or a title to be a guardian. You just need to care enough to notice when something doesn't feel right, and you need to have the courage to act on that feeling even when everyone else thinks you're overreacting. The applause started slowly, then built to something that felt more like a standing ovation for a truth that needed to be spoken. As Henry walked off the stage, he caught sight of the American flag hanging behind the podium. The same flag that had hung there during morning announcements while he sat in the back row, watching and waiting and trusting his instincts about a threat that everyone else would have dismissed. He nodded to it, not with the theatrical patriotism of political speeches, but with the quiet acknowledgement that passes between professionals who understand the weight of duty. Because that day, in a quiet high school auditorium in the heart of America, the truth had been spoken. The people who keep us safe aren't always the ones wearing uniforms or carrying weapons. Sometimes they're the ones sitting in the back row, paying attention to details that others miss, refusing to accept that the ordinary is always innocent. The greatest victories in the war for American security happen in silence. They're won by people whose names will never be in history books, whose actions will never be celebrated in parades, whose sacrifices will never be acknowledged by the people they've saved. But they happen. Every day. In schools and offices and shopping centers and community gatherings across the country. Henry Park, whose real name will remain classified, whose face will be forgotten, whose story will never be told in full, had just reminded a new generation of Americans that freedom isn't free, and safety isn't guaranteed. It's earned. One quiet observation at a time. One suspicious detail at a time. One person caring enough to look deeper when everyone else has moved on. As the graduates filed out of the auditorium toward their futures, Henry disappeared back into the anonymity that had made him so effective. By Monday morning, he would be gone from Rockford Heights, reassigned to another mission in another place where ordinary people needed extraordinary protection. But his message would remain. In a world where enemies hide in plain sight, the greatest weapon America has is ordinary citizens who refuse to stop paying attention. The man nobody noticed had just taught an entire generation how to notice everything. And somewhere in the shadows, the next threat was already forming, waiting for the next person brave enough to look beyond the surface and ask the question that could save everything. What if this isn't as innocent as it seems? Pushpin presented by the Soul Script, where stillness holds power and real stories echo far beyond the moment. Speech Balloon. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from, and remember, courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it walks the halls quietly, watching, listening, protecting. But here's what we want you to think about as you go about your day. Who around you might be Henry Park? Who might be the quiet observer, the person who notices what others miss? And more importantly, when will you be that person for someone else? Warning: this story is a fictional dramatization inspired by real intelligence and cybersecurity events that protect the homeland silently each day. The men and women who keep us safe often work in shadows, their victories uncelebrated, their names unknown. But their vigilance is the reason we can sleep peacefully in our beds. Thought Balloon: share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Tag someone who pays attention to details others miss. Let us know in the comments, have you ever had a moment when your instincts told you something wasn't right? Did you listen? Bell subscribe for more stories that remind us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear wire-rimmed glasses and carry briefcases, walking among us as guardians we never knew we needed. Remember, in a world full of noise, sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen to the silence.